Okay, so we made the optimal choice for our final speaker, judging by the attendance here. So it's a great pleasure to have Robert Huang here. Robert is on the faculty at Caltech, but he's on leave right now at Oratomic, the exciting company. He's CTO there. But he's also been thinking a lot about AI, and really looking forward to your talk.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. As a disclaimer, I think for this talk, I'm mainly speaking on behalf of myself as a theorist and researcher. The ideas or some of the comments I made are not representative of any institution. And I'm also hoping for this talk to be more of a discussion rather than I'm saying stuff. There's a lot of unanswered questions that I'm gonna pose, and I think it will be very helpful for people to speak how they think about things and discuss, because I think a lot of the questions really requires us as a community to try to think through and resolve. There's also, I think yesterday and the day before, I had I got a little bit of panic attack because I feel like some of the things I'm going to say might upset many people. But then at the end, I decided to just anonymize a lot of things that had happened. So some things might seem very high level without actual detail, because I just feel like it might be upsetting to some. That's what this talk is going to be. It will be also a pretty strange talk, and not what I'm used to. But actually, just a month ago, I also gave a related talk on a similar topic. But here, I'm going to dive in a little bit more on the kind of philosophical and societal aspect of things, and hopefully can steer some conversation among all of us. So let me begin. So as growing up, I always wanted to be a researcher because I think research has a very special place in human society. I find it to be it's a very sacred act of humanity because of multiple reasons, which I do believe many of you also believe the same. So one of it is that research is very scarce. You cannot just use money to buy some powerful mathematical discovery. So for example, 1,000 years ago, if the richest men in the world would not be able to, for example, prove a powerful theorems in math or discover new physical law in physics. It's because it's extremely scarce. There's also a big sense of selflessness involved in research. A lot of times we're just devoting our time, effort, and our entire life to try to make scientific discovery that will benefit the entire human society. So a lot of the cases, research are really acting out of selflessness. And then finally, there's also this very strong sense of timelessness in research, which is when you discover a theorem for the first time in human history, if you discover a physical law the first time in human history, this discovery will live much longer than our lifetime. And for example, a lot of things that we learn from are from thousands of years ago. Right now, are discovered by people from thousands of years ago. So, however, right now, what we have been seeing is that there's this huge wave of automation of research that are happening right now, and I think a lot of people are getting very worried about it or start discussing a lot about it. I was just, while preparing for this talk, I was searching on social media and saw, wow, yesterday and the day before, there were a lot of discussions on, for example, X about automation of research and so on. But I guess we've all seen that LMs are getting very powerful in solving self-contained math questions. For example, there's this post by Anthony and also by Antonio saying that it seems frontier models are very suitable for generating QIP-style paper, because I think at QIP, we really like to have this very succinct, very short, and very nice self-contained question. And then we spend many, many pages trying to provide a very satisfying answer to that very nice question. However, that also seems to be what the LMs are very powerful in doing. You pose a very nice self-contained question without too many contexts. The entirety of the problem is kind of in that short prompt, and now the machine can think for, say, a few hours or even like less than an hour to come up with good ideas. So for example, Anthony was trying to say that how should we restructure, for example, the coming year QIP in order to accommodate this change. For example, Victor Albert also shared on X that his agents are proving all kinds of theorems that he wanted to prove for years. And now one can just one-shot a good paper. So you can just prompt it. If you have more money, you can also just prompt it 100 times. You can prompt like 100 agents on 100 different problems, and now you get 100 good papers. So it is a very strange world that we're living in right now. And then I think one of the posts that got the most likes was from Robin Qatari, who has been collecting a lot of open questions rising in quantum computing and theoretical computer science. That he just has this bag of open questions that he has spent a long time trying to solve them, but was just unable to solve. And he just put all of them into frontier LLMs, and it seems like a good chunk of it were just being solved one shot or very efficiently. And for example, Robin was commenting that this is really an existential crisis. I also felt like it's an existential crisis. So it does seem like LLMs are becoming powerful. That is, it's forming an existential crisis for many of us. Of course, maybe just some of us. I think some people might not be so scared of it because they think they can beat all these LLMs. But then it raises this question: like, is there a way out of full automation of research? Like, is there a way such that it will not completely overwhelm the sacred act of doing research? So over the past month or past few weeks, I've been talking to many people about this, and I've been hearing quite a bit of arguments about potential way out of this. And some arguments include the following. For example, so I'm going to go through one by one and try to explain how my current understanding is. So one argument was research is about this massive knowledge accumulation and kind of compression. It's not just about solving isolated, self-contained math questions. So right now, LLMs are extremely powerful in solving these isolated, self-contained math questions. But at least right now, it does seem like it's not so good in manipulate or working on problems that are very complex. There's a lot of implicit knowledge that's required in defining the problem, in navigating the problem, and so on. And furthermore, LLMs is very goldfish-like. It has bounded memory. So it feels like it might not be able to do research. However, for some of you that are slightly more into AI literature, there's this very nice paper from 3 years ago, I think coming out of the AI labs here at Berkeley, called MEMGPT, and as well as many subsequent works that build on this idea, which have demonstrated that it's possible, and actually not quite hard, to enhance LLMs with persistent memory system. So long-term memory, where there's some way for the LLMs to access them. It could be by some random access, or it could be some other form. And by having that, it essentially allows knowledge to accumulate in this persistent memory system. And as a result, it does seem to enable continual knowledge accumulation that is very powerful for automating science and research. And if one starts playing with it right now, due to the past 3 years, there's like thousands of papers about how to design memory system that can enhance LLMs. I think right now, all the frontier models like Fable or GPT 5.6, they can also all design and improve their memory system on their own because they already have read tons of papers. And I also think in frontier labs, they're also just doing it on their own. So they're training their LLMs to be able to do things much more long term. And as a result, this argument doesn't seem will likely not hold in near term. Another argument people often also make is in terms of verification. So as we have probably seen, machines make a lot of mistakes and can build on errors. And oftentimes we need humans to verify the research output. So that's very common right now. However, for those of you who have been playing with AI, it's also, and also for example, like there's this paper by economists at MIT and also other places. They try to argue that human economic values will gradually transition from generation to verification. So they believe that in the coming several years, verification will be, or humans will basically serve as verifier of outputs generated by machines. But for those of you who have been playing with it, it's very well known of this following strategy. That is, you can set up a simple multi-agent system where you just have a verifier that sits right next to it and do adversarial attack on the output generated by the generator. And then if any bug or any error was found, it just passes back to the generator and then just keep looping it until everything is correct. And by doing this, one can essentially make, in some sense, it's like a simple form of error correction, where you can turn a weaker LLM that have certain physical error rate into an LLM that have lower logical error rate. So the output quality becomes much more improved. So it's also natural to imagine that just like humans can verify things, we can verify the output of machines, machines can also verify the output of itself. So it seems like this argument about human value still being kept by being verifier seems might also go away quite soon. There's of course also this argument about progress plateauing. Like the LMs are already trained on the entire internet, so it's probably very hard to improve. But that's also not quite true. Just like, for example, in this logical LM case, one could design a very simple multi-agent system where you just have verifier that verifies the things coming out, and then by going through that process, the output accuracy becomes much higher. One can then just use this process to generate synthetic data and utilize synthetic data to, for example, train a better LM. So by just kind of recursively and iteratively going through these processes, it's not hard to just take weaker LMs that we have right now, even if the internet data is all used, or even if we're not using any internet data anymore, one can still use these weaker LMs to form better synthetic data, to train better LMs, and use the better LMs to train even better LMs, and the process just keep going from there. So to me, I also felt like this argument about progress plateauing is not so clear. It will only plateau if it's no longer possible for one to, for example, design some complicated multi-agent system. Like no matter how you design the complicated multi-agent system, the output remains the same. So one can think of it as only when it converge, like multi-agent system is the same as a single agent system. Like only when it converge, then progress stop. But when it converges, it also basically means that a single LM is now a perfect reasoning machine that can just reason through all the information that it has. So it does seem like all of these different arguments, even though they seem correct as a potential way out of a complete automation of research, it does seem a little bit, yeah, at least there always seems way that these arguments can be shoot down.
Better thing. Like I imagine like something like distillation, like you kind of need to be above a certain threshold for it to actually do something, otherwise you're just going to make it worse. I guess. Not saying I disagree, but why do you think it'll go in like a better direction as opposed to the other direction?
Yeah. So just like in error correction, one needs to be below certain physical error rate for it to like exponentially improve. But my experience came from just looping together. For example, previously, like last year or 2 years ago, if you try to set these things up, like you just have an agent and then you just have verifier that checks it, and then you look at the output sometimes is just even worse, because the verifier also introduced error into the system, and hence the output, just like you said, like the output also become worse. But I think starting slightly earlier this year, earlier this year, I think this strategy becomes very powerful. And when you just put in verifier, it can, even if one LMs are producing things that have error, if you now put in additional verifiers in order to check them, if there's errors, they can typically find it. And as a result, reduce the entire error rate of the whole system. So from that perspective, it does seem like for many tasks that I've tried on, or basically for most tasks that I tried on, it seems to be below a threshold where if you string together multiple Asian, kind of as a logical unit, the performance improves quite substantially. So in my head, it feels like, oh, we're now below the threshold for LMs, and these exponential improvements are starting to come. And also based on talking to many of my friends at Anthropic and OpenAI, even though, of course, they would say this, but they also confirm it's the case. But that's a great question.
Towards that question, I want to point out that there is a ground truth to train on. It's just like there's no like if you write something in Lean, then there's no way that it's wrong. So
Yeah.
you can monotonically decrease your accuracy, I guess.
Yeah, there are also many scenarios, especially in theory, that Yuan could verify things algorithmically, like using automated formal verification to generate results that are just true. So that's also another way things can become better. So for example, one can have agents trying to design Lean proofs, and now if the Lean compiles, then it means it's correct. Now it can then just train on that. So that would be a true high quality thing. So yeah, but then this is slightly further away from fully automating research, but actually one can piece together all of these ideas that I just described to essentially create an outline of a machine that can automate research and automate science. So I would like to briefly talk about that. So the idea is very simple. It's like you start from some core philosophy. It could be a document about what things you care about, what you're trying to aim for, what are the directions, what's your dream that you want it to come true. You write down your core philosophy. You also write down core philosophy such as be very skeptical, etc. And basically one can turn these philosophy into an algorithm / software and / machine. So I actually talked about this like a month ago, but I think Umesh said it would be nice to revisit this idea a little bit more here. So the idea is very simple. So you start out by writing down the core philosophy. And what you do is over time you spin up LMs. So LMs is like a kind of a one-time thing that you can spin up to try to work on this knowledge base or corpus or context. Every time you spin it up, and the LLMs try to use reasoning to derive from the core philosophy. So initially, maybe you wrote down some certain axioms or certain philosophy. The LLMs can go from there to just directly turn it into a much more expanded context, which are the foundational contexts. Maybe turn some of the philosophy into policies. You turn some of the philosophies into some simple programs. And then one can also let the context be interacting with external world. So external world could be on the internet. It could also be us humans. It could also be other things. Where LMs can also be continuously spin up. Maybe like every 5 minutes we spin up LMs, where the LM will be trying to think through based on the foundational context or the external world to keep accumulating the context. So it can continuously deriving things. And then as time goes on, it can then create this entire collection of knowledge that it has accumulated, which contains the initial philosophy or the derived philosophies, the derived policies from the initial philosophy, the programs that were created by running based on the underlying philosophy, as well as answers that it have found, the results, the tests that it could up in order to test for things, and so on. And especially in math, one could think of all of these contexts, for example, could just be a bunch of formally verified theorems along with implications, intuitions, and as well as results. So it's actually very easy for everyone to do this right now. And in a sense, one can imagine that, yeah, like just by doing it, by setting up the core philosophy, writing it down properly, essentially these continuous system running will become effectively a researcher. However, there's definitely problems about how to access massive content. And some ideas include, for example, we can design a forest of skills that can be dynamically loaded. It could also be a knowledge graph, such as in retrieval augmented generation. But there's just all kinds of ways. So this is kind of connecting back to this MEM-GPT literature, where people have designed all kinds of ways for LLMs to interact with a massive data set, or corpus, or context. And but of course, one thing that one needs to be very wary of is this notion of context poisoning, because throughout this process, if an error is introduced, the context is now poisoned, and the LLM might start building on the poisoned context, and it could just create a huge AI slop. So that also happens very frequently. But of course, as LLM physical error rates start to decrease, like for example, using Fable instead of Opus, or using 5.6 instead of 5.5, the probability of it becoming a massive AI slop also start decreasing. However, even if there is a small physical error rate in LLMs, it's also not hard to set it up so that one try to balance it out. So one would also spin up verifier that try to identify errors in order to correct it, and then also along with growing. So one need to balance out between knowledge generation and also knowledge like correction or detection, like error detection and error correction. But as long as one set it up properly, like set up the rate properly, the error generation can be much slower than error removal. So first, usually that's something one can tune easily. Like you can tune it so that it's very, very conservative. Like every time when you add in a new knowledge, you will check 5 of the nodes inside this whole system in order to try to see if there's error and correct it. So these are all tunable things. But as long as one set it up properly, then one can make sure that the errors inside this entire context are very, very small. And you can also say, OK, I stop generation of knowledge right now. I just let it continuously run to debug everything, to try to find errors and correct them. And then make sure that the whole system is now corrected, then continue. It's very similar to like in designing fault-tolerant quantum computer, you would you would set it up so that you would do syntactic extraction to correct away the noise, and then you continue on to do computation and so on. There's very similar idea here that one can easily design right now with currently available LLMs. Okay. And by doing so, one can essentially say, here's a research direction that I think is very important. Please continuously accumulate knowledge along this research direction, and it will just continuously work and accumulate knowledge. Okay. So going back to this question, is there a way out of complete automation of research? It seems like it's inevitable, but it is not clear what the precise timeline would be. It could be in the next few years. It could also be another 10 years or 20 years or even longer. So, but of course, this is kind of asymptotic. Like this is just looking into the future. But this algorithm one can easily run right now. But to fully automate research, this is kind of still an asymptotic statement, which will come some point in the future. But I think what I would like everyone to start thinking about, or what I got very concerned about, is what's happening right now. And so basically what I would do now is I would present 3 scenarios where the moral correctness seems strange. And then it would be great for people to discuss what's the right way of doing things in these scenarios. So imagine the following. There's a person A who has been thinking a lot about a certain research direction for a long time. And she hasn't, let's say Alice, she hasn't published the paper yet. It hasn't appeared on arXiv, but she is invited to give a high-level talk about the new research direction that she's been pursuing. So basically, she gives a talk, and then in the talk, or at the beginning of the talk, she's presenting some new question queue that she came up with. So she actually spent a long time trying to understand things and finally came up with a very nice question queue, such that by solving that question, it will enable a lot of downstream implications. And let's say person B, Bob, is sitting in the talk, listening in the talk, and heard about the question and just puts the question into, say, a 20-agent machine. And then also puts in, like a slot machine, puts in $2,000. It's like, OK, 2,000. And then the machine starts running and running. And then, let's say, 15 minutes or 30 minutes in, Alice is still midway in her talk. So she just talked about the question and then tried to provide the context for why this question is important. But at that time, B already finds a new idea X that A also knows, but she hasn't even talked about it yet. And furthermore, building on this new idea X, because Bob maybe has put in more money into the machine than Alice, also finds another surprising, very surprising result Z that A also doesn't know. So this is a real thing that happens in real life, but I anonymize everything. Yeah, I would like to pose to all of you, who owns the credit of Z? So for example, if Bob also just write a paper next week about the surprising result Z with a single author, Bob, and say in acknowledgement that it was inspired by the talk that Alice gives, is that morally correct? Because Bob didn't do anything, or he puts in the money.
Does Bob wait for Alice to put her paper on before putting his paper on there?
Let's say Bob foresighted the paper.
Okay.
Yeah. So Alice thought very hard to come up with the question. Alice also thought very hard. Maybe Alice is not using AI much. So Alice also thought very hard to find this idea. So she came up with the idea on herself. But then let's say Bob just didn't even do anything. He was just sitting there putting in $2,000 and gets this. So yeah, the question to all of us is, like how do we do credit assignment? Like about, for example, the result Z. Of course, one way is we can say, oh, we credit the paper to AI. But that also seems very strange. So yeah, if there's any thought, please feel free to raise your hand. Oh.
Well, I mean, you know about the whole story with Suchir Balaji, right? And like what he was trying to uncover and what he wrote that blog post on.
Uh-huh.
That like basically in a lot of jurisdictions, what GPT and a lot of similar tools did was basically just go past most of the copyright laws and like copy a bunch of the internet.
Yeah.
So then like who gets the proof? I mean, who gets the credit would be like whoever all the authors were that then helped in generating the results that then the LLM is using plus person A, right? I mean, realistically, it should be that, right?
What about B?
Well, and B wrote the prompt, maybe, right?
That's true. The prompt is just, let's say, a screenshot of Alice. Took a picture and then put it in. But he pays the money. Yeah, I also agree. I do feel like some of these things, because people are not aware and put out a lot, I mean, we just put a lot of ideas onto the internet, and now machines are taking all of them. So then that also makes it tricky. But at the same time, like suppose we also think of it in a different way. Like suppose the machine was replaced by the intelligence of B. Let's say Bob is a super genius. So Bob just is super intelligent. He eats a lot, so he spends some money in eating. But he's like super genius. But then in this case, we would say the credit goes, like the credit of Z goes to B, right?
I guess the situation I think is more basic is just, person A wants to solve a problem that's public, and they put it into ChatGPT and it one-shots it. And of course, we're seeing that all the time right now.
Yeah.
I think that's a more fundamental question. I mean,
Yeah.
who gets the credit for that?
But I thought for that one, I would just say, because A spends the money, maybe it's just $20 per month. But if A spends the money, then it's
But like, for
person
example,
A's.
when I put something into ChatGPT and I hit enter,
Yeah.
someone just gave me ChatGPT. So I'm not spending any money.
That's true. You mean like the funding agency?
No,
Gets the
just
credit.
like a buddy of mine.
Ah, just that's also true.
Is it credit? I don't know.
Yeah, so I have a few other scenarios. I was like trying to make the things even more murkier, which also appears and I've been seeing a lot in real life. Like person A, similar situation, but then in addition, person B also put in some of its kind of knowledge. Like it thinks, oh, question Q is actually not the best question. One needs to slightly tweak the question and ask question Q prime. That's the more interesting question with even broader implications, downstream implications. Let's say put in $4,000. and then 30 minutes in, B finds a new idea X and also a very surprising result Z, both of which A doesn't know. Then in this case, who owns the credit of Z? Again, B didn't really put in too much, didn't put in any effort. Maybe Bob also asked AI to write the paper, so he doesn't really put in zero effort. He just put in some money. Then in that case, who gets to own the credit?
Maybe A shouldn't give the talk.
Yeah, that's also
A shouldn't give that, tell the results to everyone and not publish a paper for 5 years.
that's also true. That would be one way that.
I think since models are sort of like based off of the socio-historical knowledge gains throughout time, I think the credit really propagates throughout the entire society. Like if it's not a commercial product, like ideally I'd say that the credit is just lost in that intricate web of developments throughout history. But then I think there's another problem when it becomes commercialized because you're sort of selling the knowledge of the entire social base back to the individuals.
That's also true.
Yeah, in that case, I think I don't really have the answer.
I've been thinking about this like ever since like models first got good enough to like generate like art stuff. 'Cause I think that's like the first time we saw sort of like this accreditation problem.
Yeah.
I guess like the way I was like, thinking about it first is like this seems like the biggest thing is that it's a matter of scale and like who's doing the like I think stealing in quotes because like not trying to attach like a morality to that yet, but it's like when you think about like someone like just tracing like a single picture online, right? Like nobody has a problem with that.
Yeah.
Right. But then when it becomes like such like a large scale like mass manufacturing thing, that's like sort of when it gets scary. And like with research stuff, if I like read a bunch of like old Stack Overflow posts and like got some inspiration and stuff, you don't expect me to cite like you obviously like make important citations, but you don't like cite all of like mathematical history.
Yes.
But then like in this case, because of the scale at which it happens, it feels wrong to do that. And at first I was like, is this just sort of like a scale thing? Like when you like change the trolley problem like slightly, and it's like, oh, it's still like the same moral outline you're following, but like now the stakes are highlighted, it feels weird to follow it. And like I think maybe it's more just the fact that it is not a human. Like you don't mind a fellow human not crediting humanity. It's like we're all doing this together. But when it's like a not human, I think that's maybe part of it. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think I formalized my thoughts there.
Yeah. Thank you for it.
I think the way one way to think about it is that as it's and we don't know what the trajectory is, as you said. So it could be that we are going to be in this phase for a long time. It could be that it could be that all of this will become moot in a couple of years. So let's the second case is a little too drastic for me to talk about. So let's say that we are in this phase for a very long time. It seems to me that we are going to orthogonalize to that after a while whatever AI does will become commoditized.
Yeah.
And so we'll start giving much more credit to somebody who asks a new question, because if it is not yet the case that AI is able to do that, once AI does that, then person A is also superfluous in the story.
Yes.
So assuming person A is actually doing something that AI doesn't do, then I I would think that we would be moving towards an era where we'd actually give much more credit for the question or for the right formulation. And then, if B actually finds this new result, well, we'd say, look, that sounds green, that's just commoditized.
Yeah. I do feel, I think that's, that could be what I guess that also depends on how the community value things and move forward. But I do feel like that could be a way.
This is a terribly annoying follow-up, but is there a chance that AI will also get good at having taste? Question asking.
So I know, like, for example, I think I was talking to some people. I think people are working also on that, like how to train AI to pose interesting new question, to move in the direction. But that does seem harder at the moment. If you ask it to pose good question, it sometimes just pose random question. But it is much more capable right now that it was very good in finding answers to question. So.
Why are you focusing so much on what's the credit? Is it the accumulation of knowledge that is an important aspect? I mean, before maybe competition and people getting credit was important to drive people to actually accumulate more knowledge. But if we can have a machine that accumulates knowledge, does it even matter? I mean, do we care about assigning credit? Research was selfless in the first slide.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. So maybe this is a relevant question.
Maybe.
So.
Food costs money.
Like, unless we radically change the way we do social structures, people are given admission to schools based off of what they do, jobs based off what they do. So if you have no, maybe that should change, right?
Maybe that has to change.
Yeah, maybe it has to change. Yeah. But they're sort of, it's like they can't come together. Like, you can't have no credit and also have the same.
Yeah. Like, for example, if there's no credit, the motivations for some people might lose, and then things. But it's just supposed to be selfless. So.
I think there's a good analogy, especially in startups, where the capital allocator is typically not assigned credit compared to the company itself. Right, I think the role of the researcher moves towards building institutions. You are a research director, you are the PI, or what that looks like. But the people that are still assigned credit are the people that are still doing the work, in which case this would be the AI.
That's true. Yeah, I do feel like both person A and B should get some credit, but yeah. Yeah, here's another scenario, but I think I think people are seeing it. But for example, here's another thing that happened in real life, which is person A telling person A prime about a new question and saying that it seems very hard to solve. She doesn't know how to solve them. And then person B walking by, inspired by it, and just solved it. This also happens a lot. So again, not clear how we should think about the setting. So here's a list of questions that I was hoping that people could think about, and maybe we can discuss here. Of course, the first one we talked a lot about, which is how should we restructure credit assignment? What should publication look like? Because now if AI can just one-shot a paper with a very good paper with good results, now it seems like things become much more murkier what the publication should look like. And for example, if one just share a question or share an idea, should that count as publication? Should there be a paper which is just a few paragraphs that lays out a new idea, a new question, without going into detail or solving them? Should that also count as a valuable result to publish?
It already does, right?
In some sense, it has.
Conjecture are being extremely valuable.
That's true. That's true. So perhaps we might shift to thinking those would become even more valuable than just solving them. And also, how should conferences be structured? So let's say the next year QIP. like kind of like what people were talking about on Twitter. How should it be structured? How should we review papers? If there's some part of the world that are using AI much less than another part of the world, how do we try to balance that? If there's some places where there's a lot of capital that can be used to spend on making research progress, how should we compare that towards another place that have much less capital? So I think just some questions to throw out for people. Oh, Sally.
Hey, Robert.
Hey.
Thanks so much for. Is this the conclusion of the talk, or do you still have more slides?
This is the end of the first part of the
talk. Well, were you prompting us to discuss these open questions?
Yeah, I was hoping for that to
okay,
happen.
What's the second half of the talk about?
It's about what's left for us.
Okay, you know what? Actually, I'll let you. Let's go into the second half.
Okay.
Other questions.
Sounds good.
Sorry, good.
Yeah, but I think these are questions that maybe I think I would love to hear people's thought about how these should start looking and people's idea, and.
I think that the premise of these questions should be questioned first. Like, what's the meaning of research? Why
Yes.
are we doing research? Are
Yes.
we only doing research for results? What if nobody understands the research that is being done, and it's all in some box, and all of math was solved? What
Yes.
does it mean if no humans understand it? Does it have any meaning?
I agree. I think that's also a great question. Because I think it might be getting there very soon. Like, it just proved a lot of lean statements. And then what does that mean for us? And that's a machine can utilize those statements to do powerful things, create powerful technology, that we can just use them without understanding at all. Is that still fine? Or should we actually still try to understand it as much as possible? But I do feel like at some point we will not be fast enough in learning about everything. So maybe we'll just be delayed by the progress where the machines are, let's say by many years or something. And in that case,
But it's not as if we are racing to some progress.
Yes.
I mean, the premise of all this concern is as if humanity is racing to some progress, and we are competing against AI, and AI will beat us. But this is not what we're doing here. We are not racing to some end point. We
I
are
agree.
doing something that humans do, and it has value. Even if somebody else does it faster. It has value for us, not for somebody else. It's not something that we are selling.
Well, maybe there's this analogy with chess, where humans are no longer competitive, but there's a much larger community of people who are playing chess.
I agree with the chess analogy. I guess if LLMs can sort of construct a whole bunch of it'll become sort of like chess. But I do think like societally, like a lot of people would like prefer to be a researcher over a professional chess player, and I think that's in part because there's some sense in which like, research means more than chess. So I do think there will be like a very drastic change to happen from like research to like a chess game, and I do think like as a result, like if it really becomes chess, there'll probably be a lot less money in like, research in general, like research funding. Probably a lot less jobs, like student positions, spots in schools, things like that. Disagree?
I disagree with the analogy to chess. I think research has tremendous value for human beings, even if it doesn't provide results. It's more like movement rather than chess. So there are robots who move faster than us, cars move faster than us. But movement is important for us to a very core. And we don't delegate movement to others. We move. And research and thinking is part of this. We need to think, we need to understand, we need to make it alive. Like the knowledge needs to be alive, and we need to be connected to it. And that is something that cannot be, it's not going to be replaced by the fact that the end result is there.
It's very, I mean, one would also say it's very human to play.
Yeah,
Enjoy playing.
yeah. And
But that's
I
what
love
chess is.
chess. I love chess. But I think movement is even more fundamental. And I think you agree.
I agree. Thank you, Dory.
Comment. So it seems like one beautiful aspect of doing research is that it's personally just deeply enjoyable to think about these things. And like you were saying, maybe it's somehow akin to yoga or exercise, that it's just a helpful activity. I think what at least personally brought me into this world is that it has this, but it simultaneously carries some, maybe like it's a very long path, but some path connecting this work to human flourishing.
To human what?
Flourishing, like societal improvement. And if that link is gone, I think it just becomes different.
You believe the society improvement? I think it's. I think this is just something that companies and press is pressing us because of the economy. But is it really taking us to an improvement?
Science absolutely helps society as a whole.
Yeah, but it's but part of it is in this knowledge, playing with knowledge, and part of it is improving, part of it is not. I think a lot of the way we're thinking about it is just pumped into our brains through the fact that humanity needs to make progress fast and fast and fast. Where?
But I think that the reason that society puts money into research is that a small percentage of research is useful for society, but we don't know which part, so we just fund all of it, and we hope that. So if that reasoning no longer works, why would society put money into research?
Yeah, that's a danger for money, for funding, but it is valid danger, but it's not the same as what we're asking.
There is another aspect of research. There are historians who do research into what happened in the past, or there are any number of subjects which are doing research into just a new way of formulating something or understanding something that was really beautiful. But but it's not in some sense like doing research in math or physics, where you feel like there's a frontier that you're breaking through.
They also feel that there is a frontier.
It could be, but still, there's a sense of understanding something from a different viewpoint. The objects themselves might be a little more, but in this particular case, the question might get reformulated in the following way: what if mathematical research was more like doing history? You sort of look into what the LLM has done and say, when you try to understand it from this viewpoint, maybe it's much more beautiful if you look at it like this or like that, but it's not really going out and proving a new theorem.
I would say that this is part of, it would be considered like a new theorem, understanding what's there in a different way.
I think okay, now we'll actually engage with the discussion. It feels related to what I was about to say, that's why. I think two perspectives have been shown so far: that research exists as a human endeavor, where humans perform research because it exercises their brain, and to be human in some ways is to learn. And then there's the other perspective that's quite utilitarian, that says research exists insofar as it benefits society by producing tangible outputs, whether it be cancer diagnostics or whether it be quantum supremacy or whatnot. I think to the extent that research is for the latter purpose, you're right. The AI craze is very beneficial because it's getting us to progress as soon as possible. But I think the more we invest into the latter reason, the more we forget what Dorit is talking about, which is research falls under the larger category of learning, and learning is a human endeavor. And we can't afford to lose learning, because then we'll become banal animals. I think we need to legislate, and I think ultimately this is a policy issue, we need to legislate learning as an inevitable and inalienable human activity.
Perhaps it comes to you in a certain sense. Can I try to reformulate, and maybe you'll tell me this is not what you meant at all?
For sure.
But one way to look at it is the vast majority of research is done for the first sense you talked about it, where people are doing it because they genuinely enjoy it. The vast majority is done for that reason, not because it's going to help society or, the proximal reasons for it are that. The reason for the research enterprise as a whole is because some of it is also benefits society. But now if you are accruing the benefit to society anyway, without humans being involved in research at all, then we could make it pure research and take away this aspect where it was supposed to help us, because that's being done anyway by LLMs or AI. And now we generate enough surplus anyway, so that people can do what they want. And then some people who wish to will go back to doing research just in a more pure way.
Even if we shift to in the extreme scenario where we where LLMs completely outclass years and we have to shift to the role of an explainer, isn't that in some sense still beneficial to society? Where we can at least share in some we can't come up with keep up with the LLMs, but we can at least explain their progress to a wider audience, and thereby share in this in the beauty of that research with the wider public, and still and therefore produce some side effect that way.
I think to maybe touch on your interpretation, Umesh, it reminds me of the way in which, for instance, when humanity transitioned from hunter-gathering to agriculture, it afforded humanity more time to pursue in the creative arts. And there was massive cultural evolution during the agricultural phase of humanity. I just feel like the society in which we live promotes economic output so much so that the future that you've envisioned isn't likely to happen under capitalism. I think what will happen is rich institutions will realize that research is only economically valuable to the extent that it produces tangible output for society, and then there won't be that encouragement for researchers to get into research for the love of it. Because as a society, I don't think we promote that, and that's why I say it's a policy issue. I think we need to regulate or preserve the aspect to which research is a creative endeavor and a human endeavor.
To some extent, this is a question that affects theorists a lot, because our research is so our research has well-defined and contained problems, contained mathematical statements, as we were talking about. But in some sense, if you're thinking about the world as there are some truths in the world, and there are many true data points in the world, in some sense you could even think of these theorems as just data points. And now that we have LMs, we have access to a lot more data points suddenly. So to some extent, it's not clear to me that this makes theory research somehow very different from other fields where there's already a surplus of data, more data that you can ever hope to analyze and understand from the human level. So some examples I'm thinking of are neuroscience, where the human brain is so vast that even though we basically have images of every single thing in the human brain, there's just no way to computationally analyze all of the pathways in the brain. Or something like a particle collider, where there is so much data that people have turned to machine learning and progressed machine learning algorithms in order to just be able to filter out data from this particle collider. So maybe that's one way I'll push back on the premise of like some of these questions is like maybe one way to move forward could be to just start thinking of theorems as data points as well. And maybe that will like change how we think about just theory research versus experimental research rather than changing research as a whole.
Yeah, I wanted to take a step back and add on to what this gentleman here said. I think our current society is structured such that like concrete human labor is sort of the measure of economic value, and this goes very badly when automation is in full scope, so to speak. So I would say that current research is based on like the amount of human labor that is put into it, but once an LLM starts churning things out like automatically, like we sort of lost our positions in society because of how economic value is defined, or simply how value is defined. And I agree this definitely needs to be fixed in the policy, but I also think that as a society we should rethink how we define the notion of value itself.
I want to add on to this by saying, like, if the point is to keep math as a kind of art form and for humans and like defined by human labor, I think already we are seeing systems in place to disincentivize excessive LLM usage in research. I think like going back to the question before, I think ChatGPT should get the credits, right? If there's no personal incentive for B to get to spend these $2,000, then they won't do it, and so it will remain kind of contained to humans. And I think currently with like Erdős problems that undergraduates are solving, we don't see much credit attributed to these undergraduates already. Like we only care about the fact that it's possible by GPT, and I think this is a good like social barrier in place for keeping, I guess, mathematics stable.
Can I just say that I'm finding this discussion a little bit pointless, and I do have a question for you on this topic, which is, look, because we're talking about capitalism here, right? OpenAI is losing a ton of money, right? I mean, they're losing billions of dollars. They need like many billions in order to survive. Same thing with Anthropic, right? And they're the two ones who are driving cloud demand from Microsoft and pretty much all the other companies in their big circle of investment they're doing. So, I mean, I think the question I have for you is like, do you think that if OpenAI and Anthropic were to shut down, would we all still be able to use LLMs, and what would that even look like?
Yeah, on the technical side, there is open source LLMs, but I guess I mean I understood where you're coming from, but I don't know the answer. I mean, in some sense, all of these questions would just I don't know the answer, so people ask me about it. Like for example, students from my group and other places, hence the questions. So.
How are you doing?
Yeah, maybe is it okay if I kind of talk through? It shouldn't be as long as the first half. but it's just for me, I was like, okay, so now these things are happening, so what's left for us? These are just some of my thinking, and I think a lot of the feedbacks from all of you are also extremely valuable. But this is kind of how I was thinking, and also some of my own resolution. But of course, going back to this initial point, yeah, I think a lot of it starts falling apart. Like for example, in terms of scarcity, now one can buy more good theorems and prove new things with more money. So the scarcity thing is going down, it's being commoditized. The selflessness now also starts to become slightly strange and awkward, since one can, for example, just a rich person can pay the money and without any devotion and actually make discovery. The timeliness part also seemed to start to get a bit shaky, since even if some of the theorems were lost, one can still just regenerate them quite easily. So it gets me thinking about, so what's left for me? Like what is my economic value in this? So two other things that I think we usually focus on is labor. I think many of you talked about, like physical labor and also intellectual labor. That's what our current economy seems to focus a lot on. Physical labor actually already has been diminished quite a lot by Industrial Revolution. And then it does seem like soon, as robotics start to advance, it will likely take a lot of the rest. Intellectual labor too, it seems like the AI revolution is starting to take it now. However, actually similar things has happened in 200 years ago. Like during the process of Industrial Revolution, there is also this automation that previously a lot of people provide a lot of value in terms of physical labor, but those are getting taken away by machines. And back then, 200 years ago, there was a lot of responses to it. For example, there's this group of people that were just going around and destroying all the machines as an act to try to stop the automation process. Of course, we've seen that failed. Another direction or another response people had is to abolish ownership as a whole. And I think in places that try to implement that, it does also seem to not be working very well. However, I was kind of digging deeply into things and thinking quite hard about it. And I think we're kind of like what many of you were saying, I think we're in some sense overemphasizing these two economic value. They are right now the biggest one, and they are getting slightly diminished, getting diminished over time. But I do feel like individual humans still brings a lot of other value. And three of which likely have more, is listed here. Like one is ownership. Like for example, we should own, when we pay for the machine to do things, we should own what is being produced. There's also choice. We should be able to choose what the machines do and what direction we want the machine to go. And also dream, I think, which is related to what Dori was saying about movement, which is we each of us dream of some future where certain technology is real, maybe certain things are available to us, and we each have a different future. And I think these three are important economic value that are often overlooked and neglected. Of course, one could say, oh, but these three are human value, but how could it be of economic value? But actually, in the current society, there are many professions that actually run mostly on these values. Like for example, angel investors, venture capitalists, and many other professions were actually running primarily on these three values. So I do feel like there could be a world where research can be like that. So again, here are another list of open questions that came to me. Which is, for example, what should we value in science going forward? Or maybe, I think we're somehow thinking in terms of asymptotics, like in the future when machine can do everything. But I do, just like what Umesh was saying, I do think there is still potentially quite a period of transitory stage, which is where we are right now, where we should kind of rethink what is more valuable in science, how we should allocate resource, and how we should move forward. And also, if doing research is really now dependent on how much capital one has, then I think another important question is also how should junior researchers start at the beginning, and what would a career look like? And then the third point was just kind of what I was thinking. Like right now, frontier labs are training on everything we publish. So does it mean that when we publish things, it's basically feeding to the monopoly of some of these AI labs, and how should we do about it, and so on. So another list of questions that allows people to discuss, but maybe this discussion can wander into, I think discussion are important. And I think as near term, like we should think through, for example, at QIP, and like how should we structure the conferences, and so I think there are some near-term things that we should still think through very carefully. And that's basically it for my talk. Thank you.
It's been a very silent audience, so I'll invite people to speak up and see if they have any comments.
Yes, so there's been a lot of great ideas throughout this whole conversation, and I think it's very important to keep having these conversations as quickly and as often as possible. Approaching it from this asymptotic perspective, along with what people have already said, to me, I agree with this gentleman. What's your name?
Sorry?
No, past you. Saleh? Saleh. That it is a political question. In a world that this is quite literally, in some sense, post-scarcity in terms of knowledge, the idea of ownership, the idea of yes, funding research, like all of these things, there's lots of social norms that get called into question and calls for a political reorientation. And so I just think that we can expand our minds outside of the confines of, yes, capitalism, in terms of what is a valid way to structure society when research can be bought, right? And that inevitably leads to monopolies, et cetera. So I think it's very important to be aware of the full scope of the questions we're asking, right? And be comfortable asking such big questions, because that's what's necessary.
Thanks for the talk, Robert. So do you think that the current Lean 4 system is robust enough to withstand the whole future of proofs? There's still a couple ways to GIMP it and maybe a couple faults, and when they change from Lean 4 to from 3 to 4, they had to throw everything out, right? So do you have any opinions on this specifically?
Yeah, so I did look into Lean, but at least practically speaking, I find Lean to be, just using Lean to be, is quite constraining. I also know there's a lot of debate about whether Lean is needed or it should just all be natural language reasoning, since I think as humans we just reason natural language-wise, and science is progressing as well. So I'm not sure. There might also be other ways. So I've also been thinking a lot about what is the right way for us to have a verifiable knowledge that all of us can contribute to and can grow, which can come back to some of you were talking about. In some sense, I think the most important thing is to accumulate knowledge for the human society, in some sense, and of course also movement. There's a lot of things that are important. So I don't know if Lean is the right way for accumulating knowledge, or there could be a better way. Because I think Lean is just for math, but then, for example, in quantum computing, there are also a lot of things that are more numerical. So how do we incorporate that? Some things are more intuitive. Intuitive understanding, how do we incorporate that? So I think all of those are also important.
So I want to make a comment about what's left for us from the point of view that so we're discussing this movement, chess, and etc. I think the right way to look at it, or one way to look at it, is that there is the usefulness of the results for the economy, for other purposes, and there is the fact that science is really part of culture, and it's really a very important part of culture. It's part of not just everyone individually that does science, but it's part of this culture. And I think that for it to continue to be part of culture, which is extremely important, I think, the fact that, so if you imagine a situation in which AI just, in a blink of an eye, just creates all possible theorems, like this person in the back described, so all of this exists somewhere, and we have no understanding, and it doesn't have a meaning for us, then it's not part of our culture. And I think for us, an extremely important part of what's left for us is to really create this meaning, is to understand what's there and to understand what's meaningful for us. So to some extent, these theorems already exist because math already has, it's already there to some extent. So it's our task to, and will continue forever, to give it meaning and to understand how useful or not useful or interesting it is for us.
So I think I generally agree with most of the perspectives that have been shared, but I wanted to share maybe a bit of a variant. When I think about this question of what should we value in science or in life or whatever else, I think we should value human experience and the making sure that we retain the ability to engage in that experience. Like, to me, what it means to experience being human is to be able to explore, to play, to learn, all these things that people have said, to ponder whatever I'd like, the freedom to do so, theology, whatever you want to say. And I think when I was a kid and I went to the amusement park, it didn't matter if I knew Newtonian mechanics or not to get on the ride and to fall down and to have a ton of fun, right? And I think it's important not to, I think it's easy to, but it's important not to villainize progress either. I think that progress does not maybe have any intrinsic value in and of itself, but I don't think humans have to be involved in every step of progress in order to experience the fruits and to have experiences in our own right from the fruits of progress. And so I think that this decoupling of maybe the utility of research and the art form of experiencing math in and of itself, I think these are both separate human experiences, but I don't think we should just jettison progress because I think there are experiences to be had from that as well.
Yeah, about a year ago, so the idealist in me thought, okay, if at a point we come to this point where one can just generate new ideas, papers, and results, there is still a lot for humans to do because it's important to be able to consume them, and for it to make meaning, I think humans need to be there. But with recent developments, I find that it is hard for one person to even keep up with the not just consume the results themselves, but even know what's being done in these fields. And I feel how we share progress and how we share scientific results with each other is something that we need to really think about. Do we just now publish our ChatGPT transcripts, or what should we do?
I guess to translate all three of your points into something maybe kind of actionable, I feel like we as a community, we should be making the case as loud as we possibly can that research has the act of doing research has a societal value, and not just the results of research. That we should be making that. Okay, I'll keep this short. Yeah, we should be making that case as loud as we possibly can.
Maybe there's one before seeing if somebody else wants to speak. Let me just say one thing. To me it seems like these AI tools are, they are tools for us to use. But one aspect of it, of them that I find really quite remarkable is they also shed light on, I think, on something that's quite important, which is the nature of thought. Which is something that I would imagine that there's a large part of this, the present company that cares about it deeply, and so, and in some sense, the insight it's provided is quite very surprising, in the sense that progress came from a direction that, would have been hard to predict, and therefore its value in terms of understanding is correspondingly higher. So just throwing that out there. Is any other?
So I was kind of wondering a slightly different perspective on assigning credit, in the sense that if you have, let's say we're living in a world where maybe to some degree intellectual property rights still matter. In that sense, let's say that you have a collective frontier of research or something, and you have millions and millions of people asking relevant questions to try and push that frontier to this singular agent that is itself a collection of millions of agents, then could you possibly have a, I don't know, graph weighting algorithm that tries to estimate the weights of different questions that people are asking in order to assign credits for different ideas that people come up with, or that is collectively come up with, because in this sense, you are advancing the collective frontier in the course of research. And, you know, yeah, I was wondering whether you thought about that.
No, that's an interesting idea. I guess that will be a question for, I mean, the Frontier Labs needs to implement some of those. So.
We should wrap up. Maybe last couple of questions.
What's the distance I need to hold this from my mouth? Okay. So there was actually a good period of time before I decided to go into computer science where I was very serious about wanting to study philosophy for a good few years. And so I've been kind of resisting the urge to just start a philosophy discussion and like keep it in the realm of it being about research, because I didn't want to be too much of a tangent. But I feel like this really is not about research really so much as it is about what the human experience should be about. Because from the inception of like mankind, there's never been a time where like struggle wasn't required in order to like survive, right? Like capitalism and all this other stuff is just like a construct after the initial hunter-gathering, like you said earlier, to just like provide the value for stuff that we need to live. And now like that we're able to be like a few levels detached, we're able to create value in other ways, but it goes back to creating the initial things that we need to live. And so like just pretending for a second like we control for economy, because I'm too scared to think about, you know, if we don't control that going decently. If we just somehow like the best case scenario where we say AI just solves like all intellectual like decisions and all everything, it's like a black box that solves everything, then what's left is like just a world where mankind no longer needs to struggle in order to survive, I guess. Like just all those problems are solved. And I'm not entirely sure what to think of, because I guess we already have like systems where we don't think that people who can't, we don't believe that people who can't produce some value, like that they don't deserve to live. I don't think we think that, right? We have systems like Social Security and other stuff that show like if people can't produce enough value to live on their own, we as a collective should support them, right? And so the idea that struggle in of itself is like an integral part of the human experience, like it gets a little bit murky in that way, in the sense that like we have always like, you know, I guess in the past when we were cavemen, you know, if Greg couldn't like kill a boar, they would die of hunger. But after that, we've decided like, okay, even if someone can't do this, like other people can support them. And so I guess if we have a situation where the magic black box supports everything, and we no longer have like what do we? Yeah. So it's just, I think basically what I'm trying to say is I think this conversation just boils down to what is the meaning of life and living.
So,
yeah, thank you.
It's really close to 5, and it's sort of fitting that philosophy should get the last word here, unless you would like to add to that, Robert.
No, I was struggling quite a bit for this talk. Like Umesh invited me to give a talk on this topic. Very fortunate for that, but then at the same time, I don't know answer to any of these, and so sorry not be able to answer these questions.
Well,
yeah.
for a talk without answers, that was a wonderful talk. Thanks very much, Robert. And that was the last talk of the workshop. So again, a big thanks to all the speakers. It was a wonderful workshop.